The civil suits against P. Diddy paved the way for his arrest and federal indictment. But now that the disgraced rapper is behind bars, where does that leave the multiple accusers and their lawsuits? We're speaking with former prosecutor Melba Pearson to better understand what's ahead. I'm Gillespie, and this is Law&Crime News. P. Diddy, Puff Daddy, Sean Combs, whatever you call him, the 54-year-old rapper, label exec, and producer faces some pretty serious allegations of racketeering, sex trafficking, and transportation to engage in prostitution. On Monday, Diddy was arrested and taken into custody after a grand jury indicted him on these charges. This arrest came nearly 6 months after federal investigators raided two of Diddy's homes in both Los Angeles and Miami. We now know the feds collected guns, ammunition, electronic evidence, and more than 1,000 bottles of baby oil and lubricant when they executed those search warrants. Federal prosecutors now believe they have a major case against Diddy that could mean some serious jail time, all thanks to the evidence collected and likely some key witness testimony. This testimony and some of the evidence likely comes from the slew of civil plaintiffs who filed suit against Diddy, alleging abuse from the 90s until now. All that started with a lawsuit filed by Cassandra Ventura, who you probably know as the singer Cassie. Last November, she filed a civil suit against Diddy under the New York Survivors Act. That act meant any sexual assault survivor could file civil suit against their alleged predator, and the statute of limitations didn't matter. Cassie pointed to her lengthy relationship with Diddy, saying she endured years of abuse at the hands of Diddy, that he was prone to uncontrollable rage and frequently beat her savagely. They started working together when he was 37 and she was just 19 years old, and Cassie says Diddy started to control her almost immediately. That included things like forcing Cassie to use illegal drugs and have sex with prostitutes as Diddy watched or masturbated. Cassie's lawsuit also states that multiple times each year, Mr. Combs would violently beat Miss Ventura, that's Cassie, leaving bruises on her body, and later would hide Miss Ventura in hotels for days at a time to let her bruises heal. Cassie filed this bombshell civil lawsuit on November 16th of last year, and just one day later, it was settled outside of court. But that wasn't the end of Diddy's legal trouble. Multiple other accusers came forward under the New York Survivor Act, even mentioning Cassie's lawsuit. They alleged abuse dating back more than a decade before Cassie's relationship with Diddy. First, there's Liza Gardner, who says Diddy assaulted her in 1990 in New York. She says she met Diddy at an event there, and he got handsy when she and a friend went to an after party. Diddy then allegedly raped her. Her lawsuit goes on to allege after Combs finished doing his business, Liza Gardner laid in bed, shocked and traumatized. As she was in the process of getting dressed, someone else barged into the room, pinned her down, and forced Liza Gardner to have sex with him. After this, she says Diddy became so irate with her that he choked her to the point that she lost consciousness. Joy Dickerson-Neal alleges Diddy abused her the very next year, also in New York. Joy says Diddy intentionally drugged her, resulting in her being in a physical state where she could not independently stand or walk. After that, she alleges Diddy raped her and recorded it all on video. She found out about this video days later when a friend revealed he'd seen it. Then there's a woman identifying only as Jane Doe, who says Diddy sexually assaulted her in 2003 when she was 17. Jane Doe says she met one of Diddy's associates at a club near Detroit, and after that, he flew her on a private jet to New York just to meet with Diddy. In that lawsuit, Jane Doe includes pictures of herself at Diddy's recording studio in New York, at the very least proving she was there. Those suits were filed late last year, but the civil suits just continued into 2023. In February, another bombshell lawsuit was filed, this time by Rodney Jones, also known as the producer Lil Rod. In the 74-page lawsuit, he lays out some pretty serious allegations against Diddy, including that Diddy sexually assaulted Lil Rod, facilitated sex and drug trafficking schemes, and recorded much of this illegal activity. Lil Rod also name-dropped some major celebrities. Lil Rod even mentions in the lawsuit his allegations are corroborated with hundreds of hours of footage and audio recordings of Mr. Combs, his staff, and his guests engaging in some serious illegal activity, because Diddy apparently required Lil Rod to record him constantly. In April, Diddy was listed as a co-defendant in yet another lawsuit, this time including his son Christian, or King Combs. Grace O'Marcaigh alleges Christian Combs sexually assaulted her on a yacht in December 2022, and all this was facilitated by Diddy. The following month in May, former model Crystal McKinney filed suit against Diddy too, alleging he drugged her and sexually assaulted her in his New York City studio back in 2003. Just this month, another lawsuit was filed against Diddy, this time by singer Dawn Richard, a member of the band Danity Kane that Diddy mentored on the MTV show Making the Band. Just 5 days after that lawsuit was filed, Diddy was in hot water once again, and this time it was his arrest and federal indictment. We learned from that charging document that for decades, Diddy allegedly abused, threatened, and coerced women and others around him to fulfill his sexual desires, protect his reputation, and conceal his conduct. That conduct included things like sex trafficking, forced labor, kidnapping, arson, bribery, and obstruction of justice. So Diddy now faces those very serious federal charges, and it's likely a direct result of the many civil suits filed against him and the bombshell allegations they revealed. So where does this leave Diddy's accusers, the one who blew the lid off this alleged scheme in the first place? For that, we turn to former prosecutor Melba Pearson. You and I have talked about Diddy for so long, so many times. What are you feeling about this indictment now that it finally came down?
Well, first off, I'm just thinking about the survivors and that finally, their voices are being heard. And the truth, as ugly and disgusting as it may be, is finally starting to come out. And the reality is, Cassie basically warned us back in November of 2023 when she filed her lawsuit as to what the true character of P. Diddy is, and now it's on really on full display as a result of the extremely thorough investigation that the United States Department of Justice conducted, which resulted in the indictments we saw this week.
Cassie kind of broke the floodgates, so to speak, when she made her civil suit back in November. These crazy allegations, we'd never heard anything like it before. And then all of a sudden, we have several more people coming forward, and then more once it turns to 2024. So we have multiple plaintiffs who are coming forward alleging very similar things. I'm wondering, without these civil suits, would we even be here right now? Would Diddy even have been arrested and indicted?
I really don't think so. I really don't think so because Cassie's lawsuit opened the floodgates, and I think it empowered other survivors to come forward and tell their story. And when little Rod came forward, I think that was just another huge just a huge moment in this case, because now you have male victims coming forward, and we know statistically male victims of sexual assault generally don't report for a number of reasons, but they many times view it as an attack on their masculinity, and they're very concerned about how they would be viewed publicly. And little Rod was brave, which I really commend his bravery in standing up and saying, listen, this is what happened to me. And that empowered more and more folks to come forward, including most recently Danity Kane, one of the members of Danity Kane, stating that he had abused her and she had witnessed the abuse he had levied on others. So I think that all of these voices coming forward and saying, listen, there's something here, the feds took notice. And even though they may not have been public about it at first, we knew obviously when they searched the houses, we knew that this was getting very serious, but they were monitoring this the minute that Cassie filed her lawsuit. And when they read those allegations, I can assure you that investigation started immediately. And then as more and more survivors came forward, again, the feds would be going and interviewing each of those people, seeing what evidence they have. So, for instance, do they have maybe some cell phone footage, or can they substantiate what occurred to them in other ways, maybe follow up text messages, emails? All of these things are aspects that the feds are able to use to now bring in their case in chief against P. Diddy.
So, if Cassie's lawsuit kind of blew the lid off of these allegations against Diddy, her lawsuit is kind of a big one I always think of. And then I always move to Lil Rod's too. Obviously, every lawsuit is very important in this case, but Lil Rod's actually mentions hundreds of hours of video footage. He's talking about these illegal activities, making these pretty severe allegations, but says, hey, there's audio, video, photos. Do you think that was a big reason why the feds executed those search warrants back in March?
Absolutely, because they had to seize all of that evidence to be able to use it at trial later on down the line. So they now had specific things they were looking for because remember, a search warrant can't just be a fishing expedition. You have to be able to detail in the warrant what you're expecting to find or what you are seeking. And so with Little Rod's lawsuit, the feds were able to be like, okay, we're looking for video, we're looking for surveillance video that may have been located in this particular room. We're looking for a particular time frame when these incidences occurred. So, what evidence can we find that substantiates what occurred during that time frame while we're looking through the house? So, it all came together to be able to give the feds the information they needed to be able to do these searches effectively, follow the trail of evidence, and then lead to the indictment.
And of course, it was a grand jury that indicted Diddy. Do we think, I know it was behind closed doors, we're not sure what happened, but do we think a lot of these survivors actually testified?
I do believe that a number of the survivors would have testified. I don't think that they would have brought all of them because of the fact that number one, you want to testifying is traumatizing, especially when you're talking about the most awful day likely of your life and some very degrading things that happen to you. And you have to tell that to a bunch of people you don't know. So it's, you have to be very cautious in when and how you bring your victims and your survivors to testify, and think about that in terms of your strategy. Because again, you may want to save some of the survivors for the actual trial if this does go to trial, and maybe just pick one or two that make the point, right? And then you can fill it in with more evidence as the trial proceeds. But you don't necessarily have to show all of your evidence to the grand jury. You just pick the strongest pieces of evidence so that, again, you're not burning your survivors out before they get to the point of trial unnecessarily. Obviously, they do have to testify and tell their story so that the jury has something to deliberate on. But at the same token, you don't want to push them too much because again, that trauma is very real. And even if they are getting assistance through counseling or something along those lines, it's still a lot to have to talk about it, especially in such a huge, with a huge media frenzy around it, and so many people weighing in, and whether it be social media or other celebrities or things like that. So those are some of the things I think the assistant U.S. attorney would have been considering when deciding who should be brought in front of the grand jury to testify.
You're bringing up a really good point because, as you said, this is probably one of the darkest times of these survivors' lives. And they have to come forward with these serious allegations and relive the trauma that I'm sure they've been working to overcome. It's really tough, but we're assuming that a lot of them are going to testify at the trial, whenever that may be. And there are several accusers that have to go through and do all of that. What would it look like at the trial then?
At the trial, now the key is the U.S. Attorney's Office has to make sure that they're not going too far afield with bad character evidence. We saw how that kind of backfired in the Harvey Weinstein case, where, as well as the Bill Cosby case, where other instances were brought in that were maybe not as close in time, or more so not really enlightening the jury about what happened in the charges that were in the indictment, but more so, he's just a really bad, horrible, predatory person. That may be the truth. However, when it comes to proving the charges at hand, you have to be very focused on making sure the jury understands what happened during the timeframes that are specified in the indictment. And so, if some of these other survivors, let's say something happened 10 years ago, that might be too far in time for them to be able to testify. But if we're talking about an instance of something that happened last year, for instance, that might be closer in time to allow them to be able to testify. And again, if they have specific knowledge about certain aspects of the indictment, of course, they'll be brought to testify. But again, you have to be very cautious because you want to be able to preserve, if you're able to get a conviction, you want to be able to preserve it on appeal by not making these types of errors.
Well, looking at the indictment, they talk about a pattern that dates back to 2009. So 15 years ago. I mean, obviously, a lot has changed since then. But we do know that some of the civil suits brought by like Joy Dickerson Neal or Liza Gardner, those date back to 1990, 1991. So we have kind of seen a pattern that dates back 30 some odd years. Why do you think that investigators are going to focus on the more recent things? I know that you kind of touched on this in the past, but what about justice for Joy Dickerson Neal and Liza Gardner?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, the way that all of this came to light was through the Adult Survivors Act, which gave a pathway, a civil pathway, not a criminal pathway, but a civil pathway for survivors to be able to get justice. Now, from the criminal perspective, we have what's called the statute of limitations. So every charge except for homicide has a statute of limitations, meaning you have the prosecution has to bring the case within a certain amount of time or else that's it. They can't go back and bring it back up again. Now, in limited circumstances, again, as I was mentioning before about prior bad act evidence, if there is a specific reason that they can testify in this trial, for instance, common plan or scheme. The charge is racketeering and trying to show that he has had a pattern of recruiting people in a specific way or abusing people in a specific way. That witness from 30 years ago may be relevant, but again, you have to proceed with caution because if it's too far and too remote, again, it looks like you're just trying to make the person look bad versus is this person actually contributing something to the jury's understanding of the events that were charged in this specific indictment.
You know, all roads kind of lead back to these civil suits because obviously now we have the criminal side of things, which you've talked about, and that's going to be something we'll follow closely. But the civil side is kind of what paved the way. And I'm wondering now that Diddy is in custody, what's going to happen to these civil suits? Are they stalled? What would that look like?
What generally happens is that the civil attorneys will sort of wait and see what happens in the criminal case because so much of the evidence that comes out in the criminal case could be a treasure trove for the civil lawsuit. So, for instance, if Diddy were to get on the stand and testify, which I highly doubt he would, if he were to get on the stand and testify, his testimony can be admissible in the civil lawsuit, especially if he gives conflicting statements. He can be what we called impeached, or basically, to use the colloquialism, basically called out like, hey, you said this on this date. Now, at the criminal trial, now at the civil trial, you're saying something different, which is the truth, that sort of thing. So I think that the civil lawsuits may be on pause. Not to say that they're going to be dropped or anything along those lines, but the criminal case is what's going to take precedence right now. And then once that's disposed of meaning guilty plea or a trial, guilty, not guilty, whatever the case may be, mistrial, then the civil lawsuits will pick back up again.
Would it be in Diddy's best interest to settle all of these lawsuits now, even while he's behind bars, just so that they kind of go away?
Absolutely. But I don't know if he actually can. Because if you think about the amounts that some of the plaintiffs are asking for instance, it was just released that Cassie asked for and received $30 million. dollars. There was another $100 million verdict that was levied against him when he didn't actually show up for another civil trial. So those numbers are starting to add up. And if you think about the fact that he had to sell his stock in Revolt, he had to drop a lot of his assets. His houses are now going to be on the market. They're likely going to sell at a loss. Money is going to become a problem. And he may not be able to settle all these cases because he can't afford to. So we'll kind of see what happens there. But I don't really see a scenario where he's going to be financially able to settle all of them. But we never know. We'll see.
We're still kind of early on the criminal side of things. Obviously, he was just indicted earlier this week. But do you have any inferences of what we can expect coming up?
I think that more and more information is going to come to light in terms of the abuses that Diddy perpetuated on so many people. Um, Again, I mean, we're learning that literally he had the entire Johnson and Johnson factory in his house in terms of 1,000 bottles of baby oil and lubricants, which is just it's mind blowing because you think about the fact of how much abuse must have been going on to have that volume of items. It's just it's really, really gross and creepy when you stop and think about it. So as more and more of these little bits of evidence start to come out in public, I think that it's just going to be, number one, very disturbing, of course, for the survivors, and then for also for other people who have survived, sexual assault and abuse generally, and maybe re-triggered by seeing all that. So I know it's going to be a lot for many people observing this. But again, I just think that more truth is going to be revealed as we move forward, and we will see what happens in terms of the trial. I would anticipate that it would go to trial sometime in the next year, probably late next year, probably around this time. But yeah, this is just going to be a very disturbing and tragic situation all around. I mean, all I would say is that, much support, thoughts, and prayers to the survivors who are now on this really long road ahead of them. Not only in terms of their abuses being made public in a lot of ways and having to have to testify, but also having to survive the media scrutiny, as well as maybe the fallout in their own personal lives. So, I just really want to center them, because I know that this is going to be a very long, painful road for them.
It's important to note that Diddy denies all the allegations and has pleaded not guilty to all the federal charges against him. A statement from his legal team reads, quote, "Sean Diddy Combs is a music icon, self-made entrepreneur, loving family man, and proven philanthropist who has spent the last 30 years building an empire, adoring his children, and working to uplift the Black community. He is an imperfect person, but is not criminal." To his credit, Mr. Combs has been nothing but cooperative with this investigation, and he voluntarily relocated to New York last week in anticipation of these charges. Please reserve your judgment until you have all the facts. These are the acts of an innocent man with nothing to hide, and he looks forward to clearing his name in court. There are definitely more developments to come in the case against P. Diddy, so make sure to subscribe to our YouTube page so you'll never miss an update. Reporting for Law&Crime, I'm Gillespie.